I'm just, yeah. So, okay, so what I will do today, or Delwar and I, we will give a bit of an introduction to agri-food and agri-food supply and value chains. Yeah, so this is just an introduction, provides a bit of a broad overview about these concepts, and at the end, or well, this is my outline, so I will talk a bit, or we will talk a bit about different definitions, the importance of agri-food supply chains, a bit of a theoretical background, and then I will present a assessment framework that can be used in order to analyze supply and value chains, and a couple of examples. I will briefly talk about a global value chain, simply because I know that the export of agri-food is very important for Queensland. And then we have a bit of a look at the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the agri-food supply chains in Australia. And then also very briefly talk about food shortages in other countries and implications for Australia. Yeah, so this is a bit of an outline. This will take about an hour and then gives us enough time for a bit of a discussion after that. All right. So let's get started. So when we talk about supply and value, agri-food supply and value chain, we have to start with the agri-food system. Yeah, and that is the biophysical, societal, and economic components and their interactions that are involved in the production, distribution, consumption, and the disposal of agri-food products. Yeah, so you can see that here it's a system made up of natural elements, social elements, something like organizations, policies, law, infrastructure. And then we have the core system here, which is kind of a business economic subsystem, which consists of the production, aggregation, the processing, distribution, and consumption of the products. Yeah, so and these kind of subsystems obviously interact with each other. And the supply and value chains are a part kind of that broader agri-food system. Yeah, and when I talk about agri-food here, the products that are typically included are crop, livestock, aquaculture, and fisheries. So it's kind of the broader agri-food context, if you like. So obviously, yeah, the talk here will be on supply and value chains. So what is a supply chain? A supply chain is a sequence of processes that includes the production, distribution, and consumption of an agri-food commodity. Yeah? So there are several actors involved in that distribution network, if you like. I put down here very simplistic agri-food supply chain. It starts here typically with the production input. Yeah, it could be equipment, it could be seed. And we have the production segment here, where the kind of seed is grown out into a product that can be marketed. Then we have the processing, everything related to cleaning, grading, packaging, transforming, abattoirs, etc. Are kind of processing facilities. We have the wholesale segment here, which is typically responsible for product aggregation, consolidation, and distribution to the broader market, to the retail segment of the supply chain. So retail could be a fruit market, could be Coles, Woolworths, yeah. So usually where consumers go in order to purchase their food, restaurants, etc. Yeah, and then the last component here is typically the consumption stage of the agri-food product. So that's really a simplified version of the supply chain. Why are they important? Well, they're important simply because food is a basic human need. We need it in order to live. Yeah, nutrition and health is important for our existence, and for that we need reliable, safe and equitable food supply chains through kind of efficient distribution networks. Yeah, so that's why it is important to look at agriculture, agri-food supply chain and make sure they work appropriately, efficiently. Yeah, and very closely linked to supply chains are value chains. In fact, supply chains and value chains, or the terms of supply and value chain, are often used interchangeably. Yeah, and they are very similar, but there's a difference. So what is a supply value chain? Value chain is a strategic partnership among independent businesses, and these businesses are parts of a supply chain, so that could be farmers, processors, retailers, which collaborate with each other to progressively create a value or add in value to the agri-food product. And value creation could include something like branding, marketing, handling of the product, packaging, or transportation. Yeah, so these are kind of sorts of value creation. And they do that in order to create a collective competitive advantage, in order to differentiate that particular product from other products, yeah, from other supply chains that are available within the market. Yeah, and this is important simply because you want to make sure that businesses are kind of economically sustainable. Yeah, so that's why typically you want to make sure that you are ahead, or you can differentiate your supply chain from a business perspective from the supply chain of your competitors. So this is a value chain. And I put it here together. So on the right-hand side, we see the supply chain here, as I mentioned before, in a bit of a different illustration: production, input, production, processing, wholesale, retail, and consumption. You see that this supply chain is about the physical flow of the product from one segment of the chain to the next one, while the value chain here on the left hand are kind of the services, the added value, the creation of value within each of these stages here of the supply chain. Yeah, so the handling, the transportation, the marketing of the product at each segment of the chain, the sales, services, but also kind of secondary services, something like finance, HR, the skills of workers, of labor within each of these different segments here are also kind of value adding to the products. Yeah. So this is a differentiation between supply chain and value chain. You can see there is a very close relationship between both. So we also have factors that can affect a supply chain, the structure of a supply chain, the functioning of a supply chain, which in turn can also affect the value that is created in a supply chain. So it's really important to be aware of these factors as well. And they very broadly include market information and market access. And that can comprise consumer demand and information about consumer demand, because we know for some agri-food products, the demand, consumer demand is slightly shifting, is changing. Consumers become more conscious about production methods and the input of the production processes and their impact on the environment. Consumers are interested in becoming more interested in purchasing organic food. Yeah, so it's really important for supply chain stakeholders and producers as well to know about consumer demand, because in the end, the aim of this supply chain is to satisfy consumers and to motivate them to purchase product again. Yeah, because that's the way how everyone within the chain makes their margin in a sense. So also market information includes knowing the competitors. What is the competition? Yeah, within the industry, is there exports, imports from similar products coming to Australia? What about export markets? Information for farmers, for instance, about export markets is very important to make the decision whether to become engaged in a global value chain or not. Trade agreements, etc., all impact, can impact the structure and processes within a supply chain. Another category is the capacity, which includes something like labor characteristics, so the skills of labor within each of the segments of the supply chain. Yeah, how efficient do they work? What's their skills? What is their marketing skills and ability? The size of the production obviously can also determine the supply chain. So if there is kind of a very great bulk kind of volume produced, then the supply chain may likely look very different to a more specialized food product. The level of technology adoption becomes very important also for traceability, food traceability, which is a very hot topic in the seafood industry at the moment. So yeah, these factors, capacity, can in fact impact the structure, and also external factors. Obviously, production risks. We all know what drought may mean, can mean for the producers, agri-food producers here in Queensland. Government regulation and policies can have an impact, availability of infrastructure and R&D as well. Yeah, so it's very important to understand that there are kind of factors outside of the supply chain, of the core supply chain, that can affect the structure and the processes within. Very important as well, taking here a business perspective, is supply chain management. Yeah, taking an agribusiness perspective, supply chain management is the kind of conscious, active management of a supply chain activities in order to maximize consumer satisfaction, or the value that the consumer gets from consuming the agri-food product, and also produce a profit, sorry, because in essence that is the reason why agribusinesses kind of engage in what they're doing. Yeah, that should be their kind of core business objective. Yeah, and I put it down here, so consumer satisfaction and producer profit. And the question then would be, for supply chain management perspective, how do I do that? How do I manage my supply chain in a way that I can achieve these two objectives? Yeah, so I have to come up with a strategy as an agribusiness, and a strategy typically includes that there needs to be a review of the supply and value chain. Yeah? So what is currently done, and how could that potentially be improved? Yeah, improved in a way as a business could identify a competitive advantage within the market. Yeah, so in what way does my product can be differentiated using a supply chain approach compared to the product that my competition is offering? Yeah, and so this information then would be used in order to define my supply chain. Yeah, so these, as I mentioned before, are the kind of different segments that should be involved in this distribution network that create value, which provides this competitive advantage. And as I mentioned before, ideally this supply chain would then feed back into the business objective. Yeah, increasing consumer satisfaction, increasing profit for the business, agribusinesses. Yeah, so it's kind of a loop. Yeah, a loop. Okay, so going a step further, I'd like to talk now about supply chain coordination, which is a form of supply chain management. And it looks at the relation-based alliances among the entities that are involved in a supply chain. Yeah, and essentially these alliances are formed in order to achieve a common goal, which is typically to bring the product to the consumer, but also getting a margin for the individual supply chain entities. Yeah. So the incentives for coordination from the perspective of the producer is to minimize transaction costs. Yeah. So that could be, for instance, time and effort that the farmer spends in order to look for market opportunities. Yeah. To get market information, etc. Yeah, so that could be quite significant, and coordination with other entities could overcome this transaction costs. Also, another incentive for producers would be to manage risks and uncertainties that are related to market fluctuations, so price volatility and fluctuations in demand as well. Yeah, and obviously also ensuring that a high kind of food quality is maintained within the distribution network. Yeah, so coordination can help here. From the incentive, from the perspective of other supply chain entities, retailers or exporters, for instance, they may be interested in increased coordination simply because it could help them to consolidate reliable supply of the product. Yeah? Because if you work with a kind of large number of small farmers on a kind of spot market basis, that could be very difficult for these entities to deal with. Yeah? So having kind of a more stable relationship, coordinated relationship, could be helpful for them as well within the chain. And also consistent quality is something that these entities would see as an incentive to engage in more coordinated supply chain. So I give you some examples here. What does it mean, supply chain coordination? So I put up here the continuum of coordination for agri-food supply chains. So it basically tells a bit about the coordination intensity among producers and other supply chain stakeholders. Yeah? And here on the left end is the low level of coordination, which then moves up here to the right-hand side, the high level of supply chain coordination. The spot market is an example for low-level coordination. What happens here is basically the producer and a buyer meet at one period in time. They look at the product, agree on exchange, and that's it. Yeah, so it's really a short-term kind of exchange of product. We then have here, so there's basically not much coordination happening. We then have here the trust-based long-run relationships. So these type of coordinations are typically found between producers and kind of processors or wholesalers, and that kind of are based on kind of long-run relationships. They've been working together over 10 years. They trust each other. Farmers know they get their money on time, and they're just being engaged, although there might be other opportunities. Yeah, but just simply the trust that both sides have for each other is often an incentive to keep on working on this kind of type of coordination within the supply chain. Marketing contracts are then representing a medium level of coordination within the supply chain, and they basically establish selling and buying obligations between farmers and, for instance, abattoirs. Yeah, so farmers sell their products, their finished livestock, by contracting with the abattoir. Yeah, So it's kind of is a secure supply. It represents a secure supply for the processor and for the farmer also access to a market. Yeah, so there's a marketing contract. Then the production contract is very similar to a marketing contract. Again, there is kind of a buying-selling obligation between these two supply chain entities. But under marketing contract, there are also prescribed production, certain production inputs. Something like a specific feed for the livestock or a specific breed that is to be produced, or kind of animal welfare aspects. Yeah? Another example is organic production, yeah, that has then been described from the buyer of the product to for the farmer to comply with, basically, yeah, and that's particularly important for products that where consumers would deal with asymmetric information, meaning, you know, a consumer does not really see what he buys. If there is a sign saying, okay, it's an organic good, the consumer doesn't necessarily know if it is the case or not. Yeah, under this contract or under the production contracts, the buying agent would kind of pre-describe these production methods to ensure kind of control of these production systems, if you like. And then moving further to the right, we see then here is the contract farming option, which is a relatively high level of supply chain coordination, and it is characterized by a relationship where we have still an autonomous farmer who contracts with the processors or retailers, but the decision making about the contract, what is to be produced, how much is to be produced, is done by the buyer. Yeah, so the level of coordination is fairly centralized here, although the farmer is still independent. And a very high form of coordination here is vertical supply chain integration, which basically means that there is joint ownership over the supply chain segments. Yeah? For instance, production and processing could be combined into one kind of entity, one kind of business, if you like. Yeah? And that could be, for instance, if an abattoir owner decides also to produce livestock. So there would be ownership over the production of the good, of the agri-good, and ownership over the processing of the good. This would be a form of vertical integration. And you can see that moving along from the left to the right of this kind of spectrum, farmers, particularly here in the production contract and contract farming segments, they do potentially lose a high degree of entrepreneurial freedom, yeah, because they have to comply with these pre-described kind of processes. There is also the potential loss, a risk of unequal bargaining relationship between the buyer and the farmer as well. Yeah, so that has to be considered as well if farmers consider to become engaged in these kind of coordinations. Yeah, so there are pros and cons. From the buyer perspective, I mentioned it before, supply chain product consolidation is certainly one major aspect for them to become engaged in more coordinated supply chains. Okay, so now let's move to supply chain coordination and integration, and at this stage I hand over to Delwar.
Hi. Peggy, I think you probably need to, is this something that I need to click on here? Or, no? Speaker view, I can't get the speaker view yet.
Do you see it on your screen?
I'm seeing it in the screen, yes. Okay, they can't see me, I think.
Oh, good, Delwar, I can see
We
you.
can see you, Delwar. All good.
Okay.
We can see you, Delwar.
Okay, thank you. Well, the basic elements of the supply chains and factors affecting the agricultural supply chains already described by Peggy in summarized forms. So in here, I would like to share how actually this work, with the horizontal level of coordination or collaborations, as well as in vertical level of coordinations. So particularly, this is not much for at the left side of the integration. You can see where the lower level of coordinations. So this model actually created for where we can do the higher level of coordinations. So in here, first actually in this supply chain, particularly on the agricultural supply chain, we actually really need these horizontal collaborations between the farmers, the pack house, and also some industry leader could be a part of these horizontal collaborations. And for what? The main reason of this is for retail market, for any export market or domestic market, we need the volume, we need the quality. So this horizontal collaboration actually ensure the supply size, the volume, and the quality in here. And then actually we actually need to think about how the vertical integration can be happened. What actually Peggy already described a little bit touched so in here. So first thing is actually we started from the input providers in here, the suppliers, and the last integration is the consumers. Between this, the retailer, the wholesaler, distributors, the processors, this horizontal collaboration, the farm input and supply, they are the key actors in these horizontal collaborations. So, sorry, on these vertical collaborations. And why they will do these things. And of course, there is a main goal of this vertical collaboration is strategic intent and sustainability of the supply chains. So, and what are the elements actually that require to run this horizontal collaboration alive? So first, if you can see the left-hand side, the leaderships within the groups and the issues, the information sharing, and the partners. They are actually the initial activities that require for doing those horizontal collaborations. Either it is for the domestic supply or even it is for the international markets. And once this has been happened, then actually there is a need for ongoing operational activities to always to check whether this is happening or not happening. Is there any problem? And this is actually look. At some stage, if there is a problem in here, we need to go back actually here and then come back here again. So number one is joint identification of issues and information sharing. So this is the ongoing, this is one of the very major tasks. So issues and informations, identification not only from one of the actor in here, but from the point of all actors involved with this vertical supply chain. The second one is the trust, and this trust actually extremely important. So if there is no trust between the farmers and the wholesalers, or farmers and the wholesalers and the retailers, So there is a problem in the business, and this is very damaging. So always there is a component. So trust, how this trust can be maintained. So within the systems, there need few things that need to be considered all the time: transparency, accountability, and also the informations that actually within the supply chain, they need to put the information very transparent. And at the same time, also the some level of business confidentiality. Okay, so these are the things that we need maintaining here. Last things is not actually the least one: distribution of power. So how it works in this? For example, if some processor is a big processors, for example, high pressure processing systems, those who have the high pressure processing machines, they are big investors, they have huge power, they actually can either, in terms of their business motives, they can either help all of them, or even they can maximize their profit. What will happen if they maximize their profit? Maximize their profit means the trust and all other things actually may not work for a long time, probably work for a short time. But what is the main things of the big power? The main thing is they actually, instead of maximize the profits, they need to think about how actually they can optimize the profit, at the same time distributing the sum of the profit to the other chain members. So everyone will come up with a win-win situation, and the vertical integration will work for a long time. Well, we have some example of these vertical integrations, but we saw that none of them is actually risk-free. Okay, therefore, every year or every quarterly, they actually need to sit together and to understand what are the risks for next year or year after, or what is the risk. For example, now is the situation, is the COVID-19 situation. We saw lots of disruptions in the supply chains, not only the agriculture sectors or other sectors. I think agriculture sectors has least disruptions, but some other sectors have very high disruptions. So how actually this can be managed? How they will actually manage in a new normal situations if there is a disruptions come. So these are about the risks. So again, under the operational activities, the information sharing, the trust, the distribution of power, or the sharing the power and sharing the risks. These four components is extremely important for vertical integrations of the supply chains. Also at the same time, this also important into the horizontal supply chain. Now, a little bit more about the horizontal is why actually we need. For example, one of the farmers have 20,000 mango trees. Does he need horizontal collaborations? Okay. Well, if he has just only one farm in Central Queensland, I live in Central Queensland, that's why I'm giving an example from here. 20,000 mango farms, all the fruits comes within a month, and he need to. What about if the purchaser or the buyer from the export market or even the domestic market looking for the mango for over a 6-month period or over an 8-month periods? So in here you can see that we started the mango production in the Northern Territory is about April, May or June. And we finish about in the New South Wales coastal border is about every year or in December, January. So we have about 8 months of horizon for those production systems. So we have a supply from Australia. If you think about the export, about 6 to 8 months of mango production. So we actually need those horizontal collaboration across the regions, not only across the farmers, also across the regions. If we really looking for a successful perpetual supply chain for the export market, and this is very much similar for our domestic market as well. I think I should be shut up here, and I think next one is for Peggy.
Yep, thank you, Delwar. So the next topic I'd like to talk about is supply chain assessment. Obviously, in case you are aware that something is not going very well with your supply chain, then obviously it would make sense to have a closer look at it, assess it, review it, and then ideally amend it. Yeah. So the aim of the assessment is usually to increase the economic value or the efficiencies within the chain. Yeah, looking at obviously increasing the profitability at each of the segments and the efficiency. Yeah, so it can help to understand the structure and the processes within the chain better, and also identify factors that affect performance. Yeah, and once you've done the assessment, you can then make recommendations in order to address these potential issues, but also opportunities. Yeah. For that, we came up with a bit of a assessment matrix or a guideline that could be used in order to undertake such an assessment on an industry level. Yeah, and that is particularly important for industry associations, but also government departments. Yeah, who sometimes are interested in getting kind of an industry-wide understanding about how products are moved from input provision farmers to the consumers. Yeah. So I listed here on the left-hand side potential themes that can be used in order to assess a supply chain, and then here different kind of categories, yeah, that could be used to assess a chain. So in order to get a bit of an understanding about the product itself, it would be good to look at the food categories, perishability of the food. Is it a perishable good, a long life product, or a non-perishable? What type of freight freight type is that product? Is it a bulk product, non-bulk product? The food category in general, is it a primary good that is also consumed as a primary good, for instance a banana, or a kind of barramundi would be a kind of primary good. A secondary good would be kind of something like wheat, yeah, which is used in order to produce food that we eat, like bread. And also look at the seasonality, yeah, because supply chains may also be affected by the seasonality. And then here the second broad category looks into mapping the supply chain. Yeah, this is really important to understand the features, the structure, like who is involved in the supply chain. We know that there are some segments, the input provision, production, processing, etc. But who's actually involved? Yeah, what are the entities that are involved, and what are the links between the entities and the processes between them? Yeah, so this is really important to understand the broader network. Yeah, and here the feature would be: is it a cold chain or is it not a cold chain? Because obviously that would have an impact on the lead times as well. Yeah, what is the distance to the market? So what markets are we looking at? Is it a local market predominantly? Is it a domestic market or even an export market as well? Or is it a combination of all three? Then the structure itself, so it's a network. So who's involved, as I mentioned before? How many changes of hands are there involved in bringing the product to the market? What is the value created at each of these segments? yeah, and not just the financial value, like the increase of the product, of the value product within the within each of the segments, but also something like transportation, something like marketing, yeah, all these kind of added values which are not directly kind of measurable in a financial kind of context or perspective. Similarly, cost creation, oops, sorry, going back. From experience, I found this really difficult, cost creation within a supply chain, particularly transaction costs. So that is all involved in, you know, gathering information, spending time on changing processes, etc. So if you undertake an assessment, it is quite likely that you will struggle with getting costs. That's my experience. Then the lead time, like how long does it take for a product to be at one particular segment, processing, how long does the processing take, what's the transportation time between processors and wholesalers. Something like that is important, particularly for perishable goods. Then relationships, Delwar mentioned that before, it is very important to be aware of the relationships, the coordination within the supply chain. So something like horizontal integration, vertical integration, but also power distribution is very important. Sometimes in some supply chains, you find that the processors and the wholesalers hold kind of a very dominant role that also affect the farm gate prices, yeah, because they are kind of only one or two processors, wholesalers in one region, and farmers simply have to go through them because their product needs some type of processing before it is shifted further down the supply chain. So this dominance is very important to look at and to consider, because there could be some monopoly, which obviously could have a price effect as well. Yeah, and then I mentioned it before, kind of the factors that affect the structure and processes of supply chain: the market information, market access, capacity, and external factors. Yeah, so this is a bit of a kind of guideline that you can apply when you intend to undertake a supply chain assessment for agri-food products. So we prepared two examples, and the first example in which we used components of this matrix is about pineapples, and Delwar will present that example.
Well, we prepared two examples here for this study, for today's presentation. One with the pineapples, and another one Peggy prepared on the, I think, Western supply chain. So the pineapple, actually we showing here mostly the supply chain, not much about what value or how the value is creating, not much about the value chains on the supply chain. With a one particular case study with the tropical pines in central Queensland. So the figure that you are seeing right now, this is the typical supply chain for the whole of Australian the pineapple sectors. Of course, the pineapple is only grows in Queensland. I think there is one or two little farm in Northern Territory. So it's actually Queenslander products, and going and mostly the very tiny elements is going for exports, but and the export is going to New Zealand, actually only export to New Zealand and some of the countries next to Australia. But most of the 99% consumption is in Australia. So it's a domestic market pineapple. So you can see here how these 8 major stakeholders, actually they are situated, and how they actually maintain and managing the total supply chain. So in producers, we found 2 types of producers. One is family-owned producers. Either some producer actually farming company. but TPPL, Tropical Pines Limited, they're actually different types of entity. They're either not a producers or not a wholesalers. They're actually managing the a company who actually one kind of processors, but they're actually helping the producers, and also they are directly selling their products to the wholesalers and retailers too. So this actually very different kinds of, it's a kind of cooperatives, but we can say it's a mixed model of cooperative business, so mixed commercial business. We'll look at this bit more details on the next slides. Yes. So this is their main model, the Tropical Pines Pty Limited, and they have actually what they manage. They manage the farmers, the family-owned or farming company-owned. Actually, there's no farming company-owned producers here. All are family-owned producers here. And they're also managing the transporters, the packers. They have their own packing sheds. So they have one in Yukon in Central Queensland, one in Sunshine Coast, and also one in Townsville. So they have 3 packing sheds where they actually process the fresh produces. They have direct relationship with the wholesalers, and they have the direct relationship with retailers. And also, Tropical Pines have direct and indirect relationship with them, government officials, the government departments, policymakers, and competitors as well. So their model actually bit of unique because of the governance systems, and also they have some business principles that we're still investigating, actually working for this model, while it's not probably working for other model, but their model. And we actually named this model is cooperative, not a cooperative enterprise, or mixed business. So there is a sense of cooperatives, but at the sense of 100% corporate business rules and regulations. So what is the corporate governance here? So one is they have the representations from the growers and the shareholders in the companies, and also they have a steering where their operational management they actually manage from the Tropical Pines. So under the operational management, they actually, what are the services they're providing? Packing and marketing services, agronomy support to the farmers. They also do the coordinations of the supplies between them, retailers, the farmers, and also the wholesalers. Managing downstream supply chains. Downstream supply chain, that means that the retailer, the wholesalers, and the consumers, they maintain this. And because of maintaining this, they're actually maintaining all other 3 elements as well. So number 1 is they know the supply and demand data very well, and they do the price setting, bargain the price settings with the retail, because this is not a contract farming system, so they do the price settings. Also, they create the value with making the different product. They create the value of each of their product as well. So this is the operational management services that they provide from growers to the retailers and the consumers. What about the representation? How this representation and why this representation systems is working among the growers and the shareholders? Number 1 is growing fruits. So they have some terms and conditions, what types of fruits they should grow, or how actually the tropical pines can help them to grow the better fruits. And production decisions, they have actually backward and forward information between the tropical pines and the farmers, when and how much product they actually require for the markets. Well, one of the advantages of the tropical pines is they actually control 45% of the total fresh supply of pineapples, huge markets. Okay, so that's actually make this some of that business advantage to implement their current models. Of course, within them, the sharing informations, the value creations, and coordinating the supply. So these actually, all those supply chain factors, they actually make direct participation. So direct participation of the farmers, the growers, and also the shareholders. So that also makes a bit more certainty, give them better strategic sense of doing the business in such a way and making the business more sustainable. Thanks, Peggy. You can go for your next slide.
Thank you, Delwar. So the next example that I want to present here is about Sydney rock oysters. So in this study, we started out of the following questions. How does the supply chain network look like? Which supply chain models can be observed within the kind of broader structure of that supply network? And what determines farmers' choice for supply chain models that were observed? So you can see here, again, our kind of segments of the supply chain: input, production, processing, wholesale, retail, consumption. And what we did is we went out for interviews of stakeholders of the Sydney rock oyster supply chain and asked them what is happening in the industry, what kind of, who's involved, who's doing what, how are they linked? And this is what we found. So there is a large component of hatcheries, so hatchery seed, if you like, that is used for as a production input, but also wild spat collection. So basically, oysters are grown in estuaries, and oysters occur there naturally for this oyster species in Australia, on the east coast of Australia. So that is southeast Queensland and New South Wales. And so farmers either derive their input, production input, from the wild or from hatcheries. And then they grow it out on their farms. They harvest it after about 2.5 or 3 years. Then they do some primary processing on farm. So that's usually kind of grading, cleaning, and packaging. And then they send it off to their first point of sale. Then our question was, which are these first point of sales? What kind of supply chain models do you use in order to distribute your product from the farm to the consumer? And here in red, you see these distribution models. So one model is the direct sale model, which includes farmers selling product directly to the consumer. Could be an oyster bar on farm, could be a farm shop, something like that. They also sell their product directly to food services, so restaurants, and to fishmongers. Yeah, so this is our direct sale of oysters. Then we have the premium oyster wholesale model. So this is kind of a broker in the wholesale segment who's just focusing on kind of sourcing and selling high quality oysters, yeah, and they're only targeting high-end fine dining restaurants in the major cities in Australia. And what they do is they provide quite a lot of marketing, branding, and also support provenance characteristics of the oysters. Yeah, so they provide a profile, oyster profile, that is advertised to the restaurants and to the consumers. Yeah, simply because it increases the traceability of the good, and it provides information for the consumer about the product and how it is grown. Then we have the seafood agent. So the seafood agent is a typical kind of supply chain component in seafood supply chains. They are mostly brokers, yeah, so they buy the product, they don't physically touch it, but they just kind of arrange the kind of movement of the product within the broader supply chain. Yeah, so here they mostly sell the product then to the processors and wholesalers, which are commonly kind of integrated, and then they send it into the retail segment of the supply chain. Then here you see the PV model, and that stands for processing wholesale model, and they take up kind of most of the market in that section here. Yeah? And traditionally they have so. Actually, this proportion here, 45 to 60%, has actually been a lot higher in the past. It was more like 80%. And farmers always complained about their dominance, and that the farmers are only price takers, and the wholesalers, processors act as a kind of a monopoly, regional monopoly, where farmers simply have no kind of ability to negotiate a price. Yeah, so that was a complaint they had. And then we also see a tiny bit of export into Asian market is happening at the moment. And the proportion always has been fairly small. One reason of that is because there is no consolidation, supply chain, product consolidation happening at this stage in the industry. And the domestic market is very strong. Yeah. So we asked farmers then, as a third question, why do you choose one supply chain model over the other? We actually found that depending on the production volume, they involve one or two, perhaps three models. And our question was why? What is it? What makes you decide for that? Initially we thought, okay, it's a farm gate price, must be the farm gate price. But we were quite surprised, simply because if you look at these value chains here for the processor wholesaler model that we developed, the farm gate price is about $6.50 to $10.40 per dozen of oysters, depending on the size of the oysters. And here the premium oyster wholesale model, they only deal with medium-sized oysters, but the farm gate price is not that much different per unit, yeah, compared to the wholesale. So what is it then? What makes farmers choose for one or the other? And they said really it's also about the transaction cost. So what is involved in getting kind of engaged in one or the other model? Yeah, that's the time that you have to look for a market. It's easier if you just bring everything to the market through the wholesale or the processor and wholesalers, because they do everything for you. It is quite different if you do it by a direct sale. You know, if you have to do the smoozing with the restaurant chefs to convince them to buy your product. Social capital, kind of the relationships that I mentioned before, the kind of long-lasting relationships that farmers have built up over a period of time with their processes, for instance, are very important in their decision about which model to involve. Farmer skills. Not everyone is skilled in marketing. Some don't want to have anything to do with marketing. They purely want to focus on the production itself, and also the size and the quality of the product has an influence on farmers' decision which model to involve. So in essence, it's the created net value that a supply chain model presents for the farmers. Yeah. So this is an example of where we apply this assessment matrix. So from here, I quickly want to just briefly talk about the global value chain, which has become, or which is very important for agri-food products from Queensland. And here on the right-hand side, I have listed in an example, which is probably a very extreme example for global value chain, where inputs like fertilizer, machinery, etc., are imported to Australia in order to grow wheat. So the wheat is grown in Australia, it's then transported and milled in Indonesia, where it is also made into noodles, and the noodles are then sold and consumed worldwide. Yeah. So this is a kind of example for a global value chain. Basically what it means is that in a global value chain, there import and export segments are present. Yeah. And there is growing importance of global value chains for food, simply because globally there's growing demand for food. And that's not only volume of food, but also variety of different food types and differentiated food. Yeah, something like organic food, for instance, or fair trade food as well. Yeah, so global value chains surely have gained much in significance. And I mentioned before, Australia is very much involved in this global value chain as kind of more food, agri-food, is produced here in Australia than it's demanded by the domestic market. Yeah, so obviously the residual product is then exported to other markets, other countries, and access to export market can be an issue. Obviously, there are trade barriers. Countries try to protect themselves from export simply because they want to support their own production. Yeah, so trade agreements are necessary in order to overcome these trade barriers. But also market information is very important for farmers to make that initial decision whether to export or not. Yeah. And a global value chain also requires a high level of coordination, particularly with reliable partners domestically. So these are usually the export agents, and also in partners in the countries, in the export countries themselves. Yeah? So contracting and marketing arrangements are very important for global value chain. So what are the implications for global value chains for the Australian producers? Well, obviously it provides market differentiation, yeah, not just providing or supplying the domestic market, supplying also export markets. It helps with employment growth domestically, and that is very important for our regions here in Queensland, not just at the farm level, also within the supply chain segments. Because if there's more produced, we need more kind of drivers in order to deliver the product to the nearest port. Yeah, so there is employment growth within the segments of the supply chains. Also, there's value adding taking place because there may be different varieties of a product be demanded from that export market. Perhaps a mango that is rounder than it usually is, yeah, or more differentiated food may be demanded. Yeah, some, I don't know, some fancy type of sugar, for instance. So exporting could mean that farmers could achieve a higher farm gate price, but it may also mean that production costs may increase simply because the farmers need to meet a certain export specifications. There may also be more kind of paperwork involved in exporting agri-food products. And obviously there's the dependence on foreign demand for the product. Geopolitical situation could also be a risk, and exchange rate fluctuations. Also what is needed is investment and competitiveness to kind of underpin export performance, particularly in technology, yeah, and R&D. And if we look at the global value chain, it does not always mean export, but also import. Australia is also importing agri-food products, particularly seafood. Yeah? More than 50% of the seafood that we consume in Australia is actually imported. cheese, honey as well. Yeah, a lot of imports coming to Australia. So that is something that needs to be considered as well, because imports could have an impact on the price, the market price, and also on the farm gate prices that our domestic producers can get for their product. Yeah, so that needs to be considered as well. Just a few words from about the implication of import tariffs for Australian producers, simply because it was in the news recently. You are aware, certainly aware of the issues concerning barley export to China, where the Chinese allegated the exporters for dumping barley onto the market, and certainly there were also some kind of political reasons involved, which I don't want to kind of touch on, but I just want to say a few words about the impact of a tariff on the Australian producers. A tariff basically means it's a tax imposed on the product when it is imported to a country. It's a kind of instrument of protectionism. So if a tariff is imposed on an import product, it basically means the country wants to kind of protect their own producers from competition from other countries. Yeah? Because essentially a tariff increases the price of the imported good. Yeah? So it makes Australian products more expensive for the consumers in the foreign countries. And if the price goes up, the demand goes down. So the Australian product becomes less competitive within that market. And on a short-term basis, that is certainly a concern for the Australian producers, because it means market uncertainty. And yeah, there's obviously the need to redirect export to either new markets or existing markets. Yeah, so this is the kind of explanation, economic explanation of a tariff, the implication of an import tariff on Australian producers. Then also very topical supply chain disruptions of COVID-19, following COVID-19. And you all have seen these situations here in our supermarkets. At the onset of the COVID-19 crisis here in Australia, consumers responded in form of hoarding products, mostly non-perishable goods, pasta, flour, tin, tomatoes. So hoarding these goods, which basically was a demand shock. Yeah, so this unexpected, spontaneous consumer behavior was just overwhelming the supply chains for these particular products. You didn't see it that much for perishable goods, something like vegetables and also fruit. So it was more the non-perishable goods, and the just-in-time supply chains that supermarkets typically use in order to fill their shelves just were overwhelmed at this time. Yeah, but essentially there was no real kind of food crisis in Australia. It was just the way the supply chain was interrupted at this particular time. Another potential disruption is also the access to labor, yeah, particularly on a farm basis, where a lot of casual labor is needed at harvesting time, and we're now coming into kind of the summer months, the warmer months, where farms will need more casual laborers. And with the travel restrictions, who knows what happens in the near future here in Queensland as well. Social distancing is an issue as well. There could be a shortage of labor, which could in turn also kind of be reflected later on in increasing product prices. Yeah, social distancing is a big issue. We've seen the drama down in Melbourne in the meat factory, abattoirs, where people were just working too close to each other and getting infected with COVID. Similar examples have been seen all over the world. So this is obviously something that supply chains need to consider in future as well. Transportation can be an issue. Most of our agri-food products are transported by road. With border closures, obviously there can be delays in the supply of these food products. Export has been a big issue, particularly for seafood exporters. During early February, there was a significant drop in the demand of seafood in Asia, where Australian seafood producers mostly export their high-value product to. And that was at the kind of height of the corona crisis in China. So export of seafood more or less ceased during that time, which obviously has an impact on the producers who had to look for other markets, redirect the product to the domestic market. And also closures of food services, particularly restaurants. Products like barramundi or oysters, which are typically only sold in restaurants. Had to deal with that issue. They couldn't sell their product anymore. For some industries it was lucky because it was at a time where the main harvest season for oysters, for instance, just finished. But the question will be what will happen in future. So these are really, from a research perspective, really interesting topics because post-COVID, it would be very interesting to assess how supply chains for agri-food, specific agri-food products adapted to these challenges and what can be learned out of this adaptation process for the future. So the last point that we want to talk about here, and Delwar, maybe you could take over that. You're a bit more familiar with developing countries. So food shortages in other countries.
Peggy, do you like me to talk? Okay. Look, we in Australia, in terms of the productions, we actually we produce more than that we need. So what does it mean? It means that we can export. At the same time, we also use our excess of the foods for making some strategic relationships. So that the relationship that can gain some strategic benefit to Australia as well. So you probably know that Australian government have agreed with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And out of these goals, there's a 15 goals over there. So there's a 3 goals. One is called no poverty, zero hunger, sustainable consumption and production patterns. So these are the goals actually directly related with our agri-food supply chain. So how? We have a Australian production, we have different types of production. If I go for an example for mango, we have the very good #1 quality premium mangoes. We also have another 3 different types of mangoes as well. So it depends on the markets, but at the same time, if some of the developing countries or the poor nations, we actually can supply the mangoes. It's not free, but in the markets, but other types of mangoes that do not have access to the premium markets. So it's actually, it's not only making the market relationship, but that's also actually helping a nation with the nations. So once, as a nation, Australia needs help, so we probably can get help from them as well. So the food security, global food security, there is some nations that have actually excessive foods, like Australia, the US. There is some in the South American countries, also a couple of African countries. But most of the Asian countries, they produce mostly for their domestic consumptions. They do not have much of the products for actually exports. And you can see many of the Asian countries, even the African countries, they actually belongs to the either poor or developing nations. And Australia is very nearby to the Southeast Asian nations countries, so the Indonesia, Malaysia, the PNG, some of the island countries here. So, and they are actually either poor or developing nations. So we actually, from the strategic point of view, we actually make very serious relationship in these sectors, in these agri-food supply chain sectors, for the for our future security as well as business development with those nations. So how actually this will help? So this not only actually make Australia to other countries a strategic relationship, but also give the opportunity that Australia be the leader in these regions, leaders in these regions in these agri-food supply chains, as well as leaders in the politically to be leader in this region as well. So that's how actually the agri-food supply chain can help in this international rules. Of course, I think Peggy already mentions about some of the drought, pest disease, the conflict as well as COVID-19 situation in Australia. While the same situation have been happened in the Asian and other developing countries. So in such situation, we have access to food. We can help them, but in the business manners, and that's actually make much better and stronger relationships. And thanks, Peggy.
Yeah, and I just want to add a comment here. What is also important is not the export of the food itself, but also skills like R&D, like technologies, use of technologies, yeah, the simple kind of labor skills as well in order for these countries to deal with these situations with food shortages. Yeah, so yeah, that is important as well when we talk about agri-food supply shortages. Okay, so that pretty much leads us to the end of our presentation. I've listed some references here if you're interested and keen to read a bit more about the content that I provided or that we provided, then please go and have a read. But otherwise, yeah, we would welcome any question, comments that you may have on supply and value chains.
That was great. Thanks, Peggy. It'd be great to see if there's some questions from anyone on the call or in the webinar, because it's a great opportunity, particularly to talk, I think, about your learnings from the oyster and Delwar's ownership and governance. So you can either pop them in the chat there or ask directly, if you like.
Ben, I think you need to unmute everyone so they can talk.
Yep, all unmuted now.
Rob Lisson here from DAF. Just want to ask a question. Is in your studies, did you look at the connections or the between each of the individuals in your supply chain, your value chains, in terms of the strength of those connections and the communication levels that were going on there? My reason for the question is a lot of studies that I've done before that in value chains and supply chains is that people will use what I call sequestered information. They will take in information from markets, and then the information they give out beyond that is to their own advantage. So they often do that quite a bit, and that's what I found a lot of studies that I've done. Can you comment on that at all?
Obviously, there are always commercial interests involved within each of the segments of the supply chains. I particularly have come across something like that in the oyster example, where the farmers told me that in the past, because the processors and wholesalers dominated this mid-supply chain or these segments, they didn't pass on any information about demand, consumer demand, down to the farmers, and they didn't have an incentive, simply because they had this dominant role. There was no competition, and they knew the farmers have to deal through them, and there's no other way. And the only way to come around it was actually to introduce more competition. So more players within that mid-supply chain have helped to open up that a little bit more, so that farmers gain more information about what's going on in with the demand for oysters. How would it be possible to increase the farm gate price as well, and how to better connect with the consumer, simply because the wholesalers, they didn't have an incentive to do any type of product promotion, or product, differentiation, for instance. So it was purely the way the supply chain was kind of structured at this point in time. But yeah, with more competition, and some of the new entities in that mid segment of the supply chain came about because farmers were simply so desperate to overcome these issues. So the premium oyster wholesaler that I was talking about, she's actually a sister of an oyster farmer. So from within the production segment, there was kind of an incentive in order to diversify that mid-supply chain segment. So that is potentially a way of overcoming that. It may not work for every industry, but it is something that I have observed with that particular industry.
So Rob, I might jump in there. Like information asymmetries, some people would say it makes the world go round, and it is particularly a big part of agricultural supply chains. We've seen it, and some ways you address it are at an industry level. So say, for example, in red meat, or let's take wool. Wool was always subjectively appraised, not just by the wool classer on farm, but at sale it was pre-appraised by buyers on a subjective basis based on what their processing customers or their own processing mill would process. And in the 50s, we underwent a whole, to facing competition from man-made fibres, wool underwent a whole program of introducing objective measurement, first on fibre diameter, then on fibre length and strength, yield and so forth. And then international wool testing certificates. So that helps, and that was the idea there was like, we're not competing against each other here as wool grower, wool broker, wool buyer, wool processor, but more as an industry, we need to get more efficient and combat man-made fibres like nylon and nylon 6 or polyester and acrylic. So that was one industry response. The other one that's been more interesting in recent times around information asymmetry, and this has been the rise of these marketplaces, I suppose, has been online technology and online platforms for marketplaces, some of which have worked quite well. Let's take Alibaba as one example, and Tmall, where you not only have very good transparency through to a processor or manufacturer, but also your if you decide to buy some goods from a certain party, even underneath that, there will be a bidding or an auction or a bidding process for the courier or shipment of those goods in the background, which is where actually Alibaba made a significant amount of money. But also from a primary producer perspective, that's where you've seen grower-led red meat sort of supply chains come up. You see it. Some Southern Rock Lobster has some examples on there where they go sort of direct to consumer and build a brand. I think in in the Queensland examples, when I think about horticulture, we have had an issue there where there has been a lot of, it's the curse of the middleman, if you like. When does a middleman add value and bring two parties like customer and producer together? And what is the value that they add to that transaction? It used to be very traditionally that they don't know each other, so they're a broker. I'm a broker of that information, so that information has value. But now in these days where it's much easier to find those people, and there's these communities, there's a different sense of what that middleman's role could be. So it turns to things like payment facilitation or financing of the product. So that's when, again, I'll go back to wool. There was 180 days. So as a wool grower, you'd get paid within 7 days of selling at auction. But the wool won't leave Australia and get processed until about 60 days later. But typically the letter of credit was for 100 days. So there was 180 days of financing done there by the broker there. So that's another example of where that middle person that middleman or woman has to add value. And again, I think, there's different, and I think we grapple with it in horticulture in Australia. I think the horticulture has been very informal in terms of its relationships, and a lot has been built on information asymmetry, and keeping something. There used to be a great saying that a good wool broker would tell half of his clients that the market was going up and half his clients the market was going down. That way he'd be 50% right all of the time. So there's, it's a great topic in itself in understanding the dynamics of information and its role within value chains. So I think it's probably worth a whole webinar, and we could go on for ages. But there are, from I suppose, economic development and regional point of view, it's something we need to really could understand or develop out further. And that's where Delwar's research, I think, on some organisational governance structures, it really tries to address that information, not only information asymmetry, because information asymmetry and breaking it down also needs trust, or there's a level of trust that you need to create. And actually, for any transaction to happen, you need a level of trust. And Peggy mentioned transaction costs there before. Most transactions, whether I'm going to buy a Big Mac or whether I'm buying a container of cotton from central Queensland, the dimensions of that transaction are actually exactly the same. There's a time element, there's a specificity of the asset, there's uncertainty in conditions, there's how opportunistic could either party be? Like, could I take advantage of you and renege on that contract or not? Could I walk out on the person at McDonald's? Probably unlikely. Or could McDonald's go away and take my $2.50 and I'd not get my Big Mac? Probably unlikely. So every transaction, whether it be under those, has these exact same levels, and information is one of those costs. There's information costs, the cost of finding the buyer and the products. There's negotiation costs, the cost of doing the actual transaction. Then there's monitoring, like, did I get what I want, or did I get paid for what I delivered? So there are some good frameworks out there that we could look at and help people with understanding these value chains, because there's quite a lot involved in them, as Peggy and Delwar have looked at. But I'll stop now.
Thank you very much for that, Ben. So the reason I asked the question, I did my PhD in developing new food systems, linking farmers markets and consumers, and that was one of the big areas that really popped up out of my PhD research.
Yeah. Excellent.
Thank you, Peggy and Delwar. My name is Habib, and I am currently under supervision of Ben. I'm doing PhD, and just want to ask your sort of perspective from Peggy and Delwar, like in the perspective of pineapple value chain, supply chain, and Peggy in the Sydney oyster supply chain. Like in the slide number 8, it's mentioned that in the capacity level of technology adoption. So just want to ask that, what did you sort of like have any perspective at what factors that you found in those two different supply chains that were impacting, like how they are, what are the factors that they can sort of affect their technology adoption in their perspective?
While this is a very good questions, while the technological adoptions started from the producer level, and then actually they goes to the processor level as well. So this two lower level is very, very important. I give you one very good example from the pineapple supply chain. So these tropical pines, they actually they're sending their products to the fresh markets only. So 90% of their products going to the fresh markets. But now they're actually changing because of the changing different situations. So now they're actually putting another same business, but another entity is called the HPP plant. So they're actually using the high pressure processing systems. And through these systems, in a couple of years' times, they will produce very high quality juice. It's not from only the pineapple, from other produce as well. So they are actually putting on those things into their technological innovations in their processing systems. On the other hand, they're actually also helping with the technological innovation, but in the genetics area to the farmers. Because in central coastal area, we have some extreme weather, and nature of the extreme weather over the last 10, 12 years is actually increasing. So now actually they're bringing some, doing some genetic research, bringing also good genetics that actually give those tolerant, the variety with a tolerant, good tolerant level with those extreme weathers. So that's also the technological innovations they're actually putting in their farming systems, and they're actually helping with these farmers. So in your questions, we actually need both level good technological innovations, particularly in the Australian context, where the labor is, we have some labor, I cannot say shortage problem, but there is some labor issues, as well as we have some the volume issues. So that's why technological innovations on both levels is very important.
Yeah.
For the oyster industry, it's a little bit different simply because production-wise, the production system is fairly well developed. There's been a very large push in the past kind of 20 years in order to improve production methods, simply because there were huge issues with pests and diseases. So there's also kind of breeding programs, hatchery programs taking place in order to make the oysters more resistant for diseases, but also kind of help with the growth rates, yeah. But also the production system itself, how they grow it on farm, have developed significantly over time. So I don't think that is an issue at the moment. What is more an issue is traceability of the product within the supply chain. Because the producer says when we get consumers on the farm, they're always surprised that oyster is grown in the sea, and with different production methods, they don't know where the oysters come from. And they said it would really be an advantage if they could provide consumers with more information about the products. So they're thinking about starting something like putting a QR code, printing a QR code on an oyster. Yeah, something like that. So they're kind of experimenting with these kinds of technologies, yeah, to.
And they are willing to adopt it, or like they're willing
consumer.
to use
So these are kind of the technology, technological things that the industry, this particular industry, is currently considering.
Thank you, Peggy.
Any other questions? Or maybe suggestions for research need on supply chains? Are there any particular issues with industries that you're working with? That
Peggy, I have one question.
yeah.
What do you think is the biggest constraint to the development of aquaculture in, say, you know, far north Queensland, northern Queensland, or anywhere? What do you see are the big obstacles to growth in that sector?
That is a very good question, because I'm very passionate about aquaculture. And actually, JCU has recently undertaken a very large study of the potential of aquaculture in northern Queensland. And they came up with a long list of what needs to be done. Access to capital is one reason, simply because it takes a lot of time and a lot of resources in order to set up an aquaculture, land-based aquaculture farm. Skills in the regions are very important because you will need very particular aquaculture biologists that are working on the aquaculture, on growing fish, basically. Obviously, land and area is not so much of an issue, and I know that the Queensland government is heavily interested and investing in aquaculture sites, so dedicated aquaculture sites and strategic kind of regions. I think Rockhampton is one of them, Gladstone, and I think Townsville. So there's a lot of support from the government already, but I think it's also the skills and also for the farmers themselves to understand the importance of supply chain. So it's not just the production itself, but also what's happening after that and what do we need to develop in order to get our product to the market, which would be our markets, yeah? So simple questions like that. So there is still quite a lot to do, but I think getting investment, people interested in investing in these industries on board is probably one of the major barriers at the moment.
Cool. Any other questions from participants? Might have been. No? All right, well, it's been good to finish early, but that's been fantastic. Thanks, Delwar and Peggy, and thanks also to all of our participants for joining us. This is our second last one of this series. Next week is our last in this sort of rural economy series, and hopefully we'll get some news out soon about a bit of a virtual conference event that we're going to do in the coming months. In light of COVID, we won't be able to have our in-person annual forum. But yeah, we've had a great response to these, both by yourselves and as participants and people that are looking at some of the recordings. And this one has been recorded, so we'll edit it and put it up on the website along with Peggy and Delwar's presentation. And their contact details are on our website or on the email. So by all means, get in touch with them if you have any further questions. But and on our website, there's some work by Peggy and Delwar and some of their research. So by all means, get in touch with them. So we might close it off there and let everyone get back to their lunch. But thanks again, Peggy and Delwar, and thanks to you all for attending our Rural Economies webinar. And we'll see you all same time, same place next week.
And thank you all for your interest in this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peggy, Delwar.
Thanks, Habib.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.